He dumped me after 8 months together, no explanation, just silence. Then a text calling me a red flag. So I did what no red flag would ever do. And if you think this story ends with me begging him to come back, you're in for a surprise. The night before, he was holding my hand while I battled a fever. The next, he vanished like I'd never existed. No calls, no messages, just that single message and a wall of digital silence. It didn't make sense. We were fine, great even, or so I thought. That message shattered something inside me. I wasn't angry at first. I was stunned, hollow, frozen on my couch, still wrapped in the blanket he tucked around me. And then he blocked me. Just like that, no fight, no goodbye, no explanation that made sense. I kept staring at my phone like it might undo itself, like maybe it was a mistake, but it wasn't. I cried, I blamed myself, I replayed every memory on a loop, wondering what I did to deserve this kind of vanishing act. But nothing added up until he called back. That's when I found out it wasn't his idea. It was hers, the best friend, the girl he said was just like a sister. She decided I was a problem, and he listened. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't heartbreak. It was a betrayal. When I first met Eric, I wasn't looking for anything serious. I had just moved to the city for a new job, still settling into my tiny apartment and figuring out adulthood one coffee-stained spreadsheet at a time. Love was a luxury I didn't have time for, but Eric made it feel effortless. He had this way of showing up when I least expected it, holding an umbrella over my head in the rain, waiting outside my building just to walk me home, bringing my favorite chocolate croissants just because. He wasn't grand gestures and flowers, he was small, consistent kindness. It wasn't love at first sight, it was better, it was quiet and slow, something that grew into my daily routine before I even noticed it was happening. I started looking forward to his voice after long days. I found comfort in the way he always remembered how I took my coffee or how he never forgot to ask about my mom's health. The first time he held my hand, it was tentative, like he was asking a question, and my answer, without saying a word, was yes. We went on walks that turned into hours-long conversations about everything and nothing. He listened, not just to the words I said, but to the silence between them. He remembered things no one else ever bothered to. I remember once, after a tough day at work, I came home to find him sitting outside my apartment with takeout, a movie downloaded on his laptop, and a warm blanket ready. He didn't try to fix me, he just stayed. And in that moment, I felt seen in a way I never had before. He wasn't perfect, but he made me feel like maybe I didn't have to be either. When he introduced me to Olivia's childhood best friend, I'll admit, I was nervous. She was tall, effortlessly cool, the kind of girl who looked like she belonged on magazine covers. But she was warm, funny, and had known Eric for longer than I'd even been alive. I tried not to feel intimidated. At first, everything felt natural. The three of us even hung out a few times, brunches, movies, game nights. Olivia would tease Eric the way old friends do, and I'd laugh along, even if it sometimes made me feel like an outsider. Still, I chalked it up to history. I thought maybe I just needed time to find my place. But the more time passed, the more I started noticing little things. Olivia had opinions about everything: where Eric should work, who he should hang out with, how often he should see me. And Eric, he always listened. Still, I didn't let it bother me. I was falling for him too fast to pump the brakes. There were moments when I truly believed he might be the one, like the time we danced barefoot in my kitchen at midnight, burning pancakes and laughing until our stomachs hurt. Or when he kissed my forehead and said, "You make me want to try harder at everything." I held on to those moments fiercely. Because despite Olivia's presence, despite the tiny slivers of doubt that started to creep in, there was something about the way Eric looked at me like I was home. And when you believe you've found a home, you don't imagine it'll ever throw you out. There was a time when I would have done anything for him, and I did, quietly. without expecting anything in return. When his car broke down during one of the coldest nights of winter, I took 2 trains and a cab just to bring him a thermos of hot coffee and wait with him for a tow truck. He called me his ride or die that night. I remember smiling like an idiot the entire way home. When he was stressed about a presentation at work, I stayed up until 3 a.m. helping him rehearse, sitting on the floor in his living room, whispering encouragements between yawns. I made flashcards. I even skipped work the next morning so I could be there when he walked out of the meeting room. He ran into my arms and told me he nailed it, said I was his good luck charm. He met my parents, took my dad fishing, helped my mom set up a smart TV she didn't even know she needed. They loved him. My friends joked about how he was husband material. For a while, I believed it too. I trusted him with the softest, most bruised parts of me. I told him things I'd never told anyone. About the night I sat crying in the back of a cab after my ex cheated on me. About how I once faked confidence at a job interview while battling anxiety so strong I almost didn't show up. And he listened, held me, promised that I'd never feel that small again. That's why it hit so hard, not just the breakup, but the way he left without looking back, without remembering all the ways I'd stood by him, without even asking me if what she said was true, because in my mind we were a team. And now I realize I was playing for two. It started small. At first, I brushed it off. Those tiny moments that whispered something wasn't quite right. Like the time Olivia made a joke about how cleany girlfriends always ruin the vibe while looking directly at me. We were at brunch, sitting across from each other, and I remember laughing nervously, unsure if I was just being too sensitive. Eric didn't say anything. He just sipped his mimosa and changed the subject. Then came the weekends. Eric and I had started this tradition where Saturday nights were ours. We'd cook together, pick a terrible movie, and cuddle on the couch until we fell asleep. But slowly, those nights started disappearing. He'd tell me, Liv and I already made plans, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I'd try to suggest another night, but it always felt like I was squeezing into his schedule, like I was the backup plan. One weekend, I asked if he wanted to come to my friend's gallery opening. It was important to me. My friend had worked so hard and I wanted Eric there beside me. He declined. Olivia needs help moving some furniture, he said. And just like that, I found myself standing alone at the event, fake smiling while explaining his absence to everyone. I kept telling myself he meant well, that he was just being a good friend, but inside I was crumbling. It wasn't just about Olivia, it was how he made me feel invisible whenever she was around. Anytime the three of us were together, she'd dominate the conversation. She'd bring up inside jokes I didn't understand, childhood stories that excluded me. If I tried to join in, I'd get a polite nod or a tight smile, like I was a guest in their world, not his girlfriend. Once I brought cupcakes to his office as a surprise. It was our 6-month anniversary, and I thought it'd be sweet to drop them off. Olivia was there. She opened the box, smirked, and said, "That's cute. You're really going all in, huh?" Eric just laughed. I stood there, heat rising in my cheeks, pretending I didn't hear the condescension. The real breaking point came when I started changing myself just to keep the peace. I stopped asking to spend more time with him. I stopped inviting him to my events. I let Olivia pick restaurants, movies, and even what weekends they'd spend together. I didn't want to seem demanding or controlling because somehow I'd become the one on trial. He never said it out loud, but it was clear. Olivia was untouchable. If there was ever a choice to be made, I would lose. Once, I asked him directly if you had to choose her or me. He looked at me like I'd asked him to cut off his arm. "Don't make me do that," he whispered. And that's when I knew. I was in a relationship with a man whose loyalty wasn't mine to keep. I remember one afternoon I was crying, not hysterically, just quiet tears after a long, frustrating day. Eric was at my place, but instead of holding me or asking what was wrong, he kept glancing at the clock. "I told Liv I'd meet her at the bookstore," he finally said. I wiped my eyes, nodded, and said, "Go." He left. That night, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how I ended up in a relationship where I felt like a guest in my own boyfriend's life. I started avoiding Olivia altogether. I stopped replying to her messages and stopped accepting invites. I hoped maybe if I distanced myself, she'd stop feeling so threatened. But she didn't back off. If anything, she got worse. I noticed she started calling Eric more late at night, early mornings, during our dinners. Sometimes she'd FaceTime while we were lying in bed and Eric would pick up. I'd stare at the ceiling while they laughed about God knows what, and he'd forget I was even there. Once she called while he was kissing me. He pulled away to answer. That was the first time I felt something break. Not in my heart, but in my pride. Whatever. I told myself I wouldn't bring it up, that if he loved me, he'd see it for himself, that love was enough. But love, I was beginning to learn, doesn't mean much when someone else is pulling the strings. The hardest part wasn't even Olivia. It was Eric, his silence, his passivity, his refusal to set boundaries. Every time I tried to express how I felt, he'd tell me I was overthinking it, that Olivia didn't mean anything by it, that I was imagining things. So I stopped talking. I began editing myself around them, like walking on a tightrope stretched between eggshells. I laughed less, I shared less, I smiled even when it hurt. I didn't want to be the jealous girlfriend, the stereotype Olivia was silently daring me to become. But inside, I was shrinking. I used to be so sure of myself, loud, joyful, a little impulsive. But with Eric, I became careful. I second-guessed my texts, rewrote my messages, timed my calls. Every move felt like it needed permission. One night, I overheard Olivia on speakerphone while Eric was driving us home. She was talking about a trip they were planning without me, a road trip to the mountains, just the two of them, like old times. I waited for him to say something, anything, but he just nodded and said, "Sounds fun." When I asked him later why I hadn't been invited, he shrugged. "It's kind of our thing," he said. "We've done it for years." I nodded too. I was getting good at that. But that night, I cried in the shower, not because he was going without me, but because I realized I was no longer part of the future he imagined. I was just the present he tolerated. The night it all fell apart wasn't dramatic, not at first. I was sick, just a stomach bug, nothing major. My roommate was out of town, and I didn't have family nearby. Normally, I'd have toughed it out with Netflix and toast, but I was weak, lightheaded, and just needed someone who cared. So I called Eric. He picked up on the third ring. I told him how bad I felt, how I couldn't even keep water down. I wasn't asking for much, just some company, maybe help with soup or groceries. There was a pause, then he said, "I have plans with Liv today. We're catching a movie, then lunch." My throat went dry, but not from the illness. I tried to reason with him, told him it was probably just a stomach bug, that I wasn't contagious, that I'd really appreciate the help, but the hesitation in his voice remained, like he was calculating whether I was worth the inconvenience. And then I snapped. "Maybe you should just date Olivia," I said, "since clearly she's your priority." I hung up before he could answer, blocked his number, tossed my phone across the couch and curled into myself, shaking from fever and fury. But he did come. An hour later, my buzzer rang. It was him, with soup, crackers, and the same apologetic eyes I'd seen too many times before. He said he canceled his plans with Olivia, said he was sorry for hesitating, and for a brief, deluded moment, I believed him. We spent the day together. He held my hand, wiped my forehead with a damp towel, and told me I was strong, stubborn, and beautiful even while sick. By the time he left, I felt better, not just physically, but emotionally. I thought we'd turned a corner. I was wrong. The next day, he ghosted me. No good morning text, no reply to mine, no calls, radio silence. By 8 p.m., I was panicking. I called straight to voicemail. I texted, no reply. I started replaying everything. Had I said something wrong? Did I overreact? Was I too harsh when I hung up the day before? At midnight, my phone rang. It was him. "Hey," he said, voice quiet. "Are you feeling better?" I remember the warmth that surged through me. He was checking in. He cared. Then he said, "You might want to sit down for this." My stomach dropped. "I've been thinking," he continued, "and I realized there are too many red flags. I don't think we're good for each other." I waited for the punchline, for the just kidding, but it never came. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "I'm sorry." And then he hung up. And just like that, it was over. No warning, no fight, no discussion, just a diagnosis. Red flags. A vague, impersonal label for a relationship he didn't even try to salvage. I tried to call him back, straight to voicemail. I opened Instagram, blocked. WhatsApp, blocked. Everywhere. He'd erased me. I sat in that silence for what felt like hours, stunned and humiliated. Just yesterday, he was holding my hand. Now, he couldn't even say goodbye to my face. I felt small, worthless, disposable. And I blamed myself. I spiraled for days, didn't eat, barely slept, walked through work like a ghost, snapping back only when someone asks, "Everything okay?" I lied every time. I kept thinking about what I'd done. Had I guilt-tripped him too hard? Was I too emotional? Too needy? I started believing it. Maybe I was the red flag. Until he called. 4 days later at 2 a.m., he sounded different, nervous, shaky, like a man trying to outrun his own guilt. "I didn't want to break up," he said. "Olivia convinced me. She said you were controlling, manipulative, that you were trying to isolate me." I said nothing. She brought up the soup thing, said you used being sick to make me cancel on her. She called that a red flag. Still, I said nothing. He continued, rapid fire now, like a dam had burst. "She said you buying clothes for me was controlling, that you were trying to change me, that you're emotionally manipulative." I almost laughed, because at that moment, it all clicked. Olivia had always hated me. And he had always let her. This wasn't just a breakup, it was a betrayal, cold, calculated, and cowardly. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I told him I needed time. But inside, I was done. I had cried enough for a man who let someone else do his thinking. I had mourned a love that wasn't even real. It was a puppet show. And I was tired of being the marionette. But of course, he wasn't done. He kept calling, apologizing, rationalizing, begging, said he missed me, said Olivia had twisted things, that he realized she didn't have his best interests at heart, that he'd do anything to make it right, anything except take responsibility. He wanted me back, but he also wanted to keep Olivia, wanted to manage the situation, even had the nerve to suggest we keep our relationship quiet so it wouldn't upset her. That was when I snapped. "Let me get this straight," I said. "You dumped me because she told you to. You blocked me without warning. You let me believe I was the problem, and now you want me back, but only if we hide it from her?" He went quiet. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked. He stammered, said it wasn't like that, said I was twisting things. I hung up. For the first time in days, I didn't cry. I sat in my room, the lights off, just breathing, letting the reality settle into my bones. This man was not who I thought he was. And maybe he never had been. What broke me wasn't the breakup. It was the betrayal of trust, the complete disregard for my feelings, and the way he weaponized my love against me, the way he let someone else write the narrative of who I was. I had offered him everything, and in return, he'd offered my dignity to Olivia like it was a gift. I spent that night wide awake, replaying every memory, not to blame myself, but to see clearly, to finally tell me the truth. This wasn't love. It was control, codependence, cowardice. and it would never happen to me again. The days after that call blurred into each other like rain on a windshield. I moved through time, but I wasn't really in it. I answered emails, I went to meetings, I even smiled when someone cracked a joke at work, but inside, I was hollow. Like my heart had packed its bags and left without telling me. I stopped listening to music, everything had lyrics that reminded me of him. I deleted all our photos from my phone, then undeleted them, then deleted them again. I blocked him on everything, but still checked his socials through a friend's profile, torturing myself with pictures I didn't even want to see. He looked fine, happy even. I, on the other hand, cried into my pillow every night until my face felt swollen in the morning. My eyes were constantly red, and no amount of concealer could cover the way I was unraveling. The worst part, no one knew. Didn't tell my parents. I couldn't face the pity. I didn't tell most of my friends because I knew what they'd say, that I was better off, that he didn't deserve me, that I had dodged a bullet. They were right, but I didn't want right. I wanted comfort. I wanted someone to sit with me in the dark and not try to turn on the light. I kept replaying the last few months like a bad movie, remembering how many signs I'd ignored, how many red flags I'd painted white just to feel loved. I remembered the first time he kissed my forehead and said, "You're safe with me," and how I'd believed him, how I'd built a home in his words, only to watch it collapse the moment someone else told him to burn it down. I started questioning myself in ways I hadn't since I was 16. Was I too much, too emotional, too intense? Did I love too loudly? Was that why people always left? Every message Olivia had fed him started worming its way into my brain. Maybe I was manipulative. Maybe I had tried too hard to be good. Maybe the way I loved was a burden. That's the thing about being broken by someone you trusted. You start picking up the shards and using them against yourself. I began shrinking my presence. At work, I kept my opinions to myself. In group chats, I stopped initiating. I became quieter, smaller, invisible. And still, the pain didn't go away. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was texting her, if they laughed at me, if he ever regretted what he did, or if I'd simply been a temporary distraction from someone he was always going to choose in the end. There were nights I wanted to call him, not to get back together, but to scream, to ask how he could sleep at night after what he'd done, but I never did. Because even in my heartbreak, I still had more dignity than he ever did. One night, maybe 2 weeks after everything fell apart, I found myself standing in front of my bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, and suddenly I burst into tears. Not the silent kind, not the cinematic tear trickling down the cheek kind, I mean full body sobbing. Ugly, messy, loud. It hit me that I hadn't truly let it out. I'd been trying so hard to seem fine, to move on, to not give him the satisfaction of knowing he broke me, that I'd denied myself the permission to grieve. So I let myself break. I sat on the bathroom floor and cried until my stomach hurt, until I couldn't breathe, until my body felt like it had purged something toxic. And then quiet, not peace, not yet, but a space, a pause, a breath. It was the first moment I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and a pillowcase stained with mascara. But something was different. I wasn't better, but I wasn't numb anymore either. I got up, made coffee, washed my face, opened the windows. It hurt, yes, but it was a clean kind of hurt, like pressing on a bruise to remind yourself it's healing. For the first time in weeks, I texted a friend back. I said yes to brunch. I put on real clothes. I even put on lipstick just to see if I still looked like myself. And I did, just a little duller. At brunch, I laughed. Genuinely, it startled me. I caught my reflection in the restaurant window and thought, she's still in there. The girl who loves deeply, the girl who forgives too much, the girl who dares to hope. That night, I journaled for hours, pages and pages of everything I never got to say to him, every question he left unanswered, every apology I never received, Every moment I wish I could take back. I wrote until my hand was cramped. Then I burned it. I lit a match, dropped the pages into a metal bowl on my balcony, and watched the flames consume every word. It didn't erase the pain, but it felt like reclaiming something. Control, agency, my voice. In somewhere in the middle of those ashes, I found a flicker of something I thought I'd lost. Hope. Not hope that he'd come back, not hope that things would be like before, hope that I'd be okay, that I could rebuild. Because the truth was, he hadn't destroyed me. He'd only exposed the cracks I'd hidden for years, the places where I needed to heal, the parts of me that still didn't believe I deserved better. Now I was ready to fix them, not for him, for me. So, no, I wasn't whole yet, but I was no longer broken, just in progress. Healing didn't happen overnight. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly free of pain or anger, but the more I gave myself permission to feel, the less power those feelings had over me. I started running again, nothing major, just a few blocks around my neighborhood. But every footstep felt like reclaiming something, my body, my breath, my pace. I started sleeping better, eating again. I even laughed more often, really laughed, the kind that comes from your gut and surprises you. The world didn't look different, but I did. One Saturday morning, I walked into a bookstore and bought a blank journal. I wrote on the first page, "This story is mine now." And I made it a habit writing each morning, even if it was just a sentence. At first, the pages were filled with grief, rage, regret, then with gratitude, forgiveness, little victories, like the day I ran 3 miles without stopping, or the night I deleted every last trace of Eric from my hard drive, my cloud storage, and most importantly, my heart. I reconnected with old friends, ones I'd unintentionally pushed away while drowning in that toxic relationship. They welcomed me back without judgment, and in their warmth, I remembered the version of me I used to be. I started showing up for myself the way I used to show up for others. Signed up for a pottery class, took a solo day trip to the coast. I sat on the sand with a book and didn't check my phone once. That's when it hit me. I didn't miss him anymore. I missed who I was when I loved him. But that version of me, she wasn't gone. She was evolving. Around this time, Olivia tried to contact me. A message from an unknown number, "We should talk." I didn't respond. Not because I was scared, but because I had nothing left to say. That chapter was closed, locked, archived. I wasn't going to let her reopen wounds just to soothe her own ego. A week later, Eric emailed me, not to apologize, just to check in. I stared at that email for a full 5 minutes. Then, without opening it, I moved it to trash. No part of me wanted to re-engage. There was no curiosity, no ache, just peace. I was finally at a place where silence didn't mean avoidance, it meant protection. And I had become my protector. Then something unexpected happened. I met someone. It wasn't fireworks in slow motion like the movies. It was coffee at a bookstore, a casual chat about favorite authors, then a shared laugh, a comfortable silence, and the feeling that I didn't have to perform. He didn't try to impress me. He didn't ask about my past. He just listened to what I offered. And I didn't feel the need to offer everything. It felt safe. So we've gone on a few dates since then. I'm taking it slow, carefully. But this time, I'm not molding myself to fit into someone's life. I'm building mine. And if someone wants to join me on the journey, great. But I'll never lose myself in someone else's orbit again. Because the most powerful thing I've learned is this: love shouldn't feel like sacrifice. It shouldn't feel like silence. It shouldn't come with terms written by someone else. Love, real love, feels like sunlight, gentle, consistent, warm, and I am finally standing where it shines. One of the biggest shifts happened the day I stopped looking for closure from him and started creating closure for myself. I wrote a letter I would never send. I poured every ounce of truth onto the page. Every "you hurt me," every "I deserved better," every "thank you for teaching me what I won't tolerate again." Then I folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and tucked it into a box at the back of my closet. Not to forget, but to remind myself I'd survived. And then I focused on building. I took on a new project at work, threw myself into it, gave it everything I had, and was surprised when my boss pulled me aside to tell me how impressed he was. "You've stepped up lately," he said. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I smiled because what I was doing was healing, one small piece at a time. Even my apartment changed. I redecorated, moved furniture around, got rid of the blanket he always used when he stayed over, bought plants, lit candles that smelled like vanilla and cedar and hope. Every inch of space became mine again. Started speaking up more in meetings, in conversations, in life. My voice, once cautious, is now steady, confident, certain. I even ran into Eric once at the grocery store. He looked surprised, tried to say hello. I nodded politely and walked right past him. No hatred, no bitterness, just indifference. Later that night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, the same one where I'd once collapsed in sobs, and I smiled at my reflection. Because of that girl, she was no longer broken. She was becoming someone she could finally be proud of. And she was just getting started. The real test came on a rainy Tuesday. I got home late, soaked to the bone, exhausted. I dropped my keys, kicked off my shoes, and flopped onto the couch. A few months ago, a night like that would have broken me. I would have cried, wished for someone to hold me, to tell me I'd be okay. But instead I laughed. I made tea, put on a playlist, danced around in my living room, wet hair and all, and it hit me. This was it. Not a grand epiphany, not a movie moment, just quiet, defiant joy. The joy that I had built. I used to think healing would feel like a sunrise, sudden, golden, blinding. But it's more like a slow-burning candle, soft, steady, unshakable. I don't miss the relationship, not even a little. What I miss, maybe, is the illusion, the dream I clung to. But I've replaced it with something far more real, myself. I'm not just healing, I've risen. It started with a party. Our mutual friend who'd introduced us in the first place was throwing a birthday bash. I hadn't seen most of our old group since the breakup, but something in me felt ready, steady. I bought a red silk dress, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because it made me feel powerful, like a flame no one could extinguish. When I arrived, the room buzzed with energy, music, lights, chatter, and then I saw them, Eric and Olivia, standing in the corner, whispering like middle schoolers. They hadn't seen me yet. I didn't avoid them. I didn't seek them out either. I just floated through the room like I owned the air inside it. People gravitated toward me. Friends who hadn't heard from me in months were suddenly all smiles and hugs. "You look amazing. We missed you. You seem different." I am. About 30 minutes in, Eric approached. He wore that same smirk I once found charming. Now it looked juvenile. "Wow," he said, eyes flicking up and down. "You look good." I sipped my drink. "I do." He blinked, not expecting that. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "That makes sense," I replied, calm. "You never did know much about where I belonged." Olivia slithered up beside him, fake smile plastered on. "Hey," she chirped. "Long time." I looked her square in the eyes. "Not long enough." The silence that followed was delicious. "I heard you're seeing someone," Eric tried again, clearly rattled. "That was quick." I tilted my head. And yet, Not as quick as you were to throw me away. His face dropped. You know, I continued, voice still gentle, it's wild how someone can spend 8 months with you and still not know your worth. But I guess it's hard to see clearly when someone else is always holding the flashlight. Olivia's eyes narrowed. If you have something to say to me, I smiled. Oh, honey, I already did. Through him? Remember those texts he sent? Every word? Mine. She flinched. Eric looked like he wanted to vanish. And you know what? I added, he thought sending those texts would win me back, but all they won was my closure. People nearby were listening now. I didn't care. I turned to walk away, but paused. You two deserve each other, truly. You both love control, and you both confuse attention for affection. I hope it works out. And then I walked away, head high, heart light. But that wasn't the end. A week later, I got a call from a friend who worked with both of them. Olivia had been crying in the break room. Eric had started pulling away from her emotionally and socially. People were noticing. He'd told someone that being with her feels like being watched all the time, that he misses how free he used to feel. The irony, beautiful. And I didn't gloat. I didn't post cryptic quotes on social media. I didn't subtweet. I just lived. Gloriously, publicly, authentically. Every photo I posted, every story I shared, it wasn't revenge, it was radiance. And if it burned them to watch me thrive, that was just a bonus. Because the best revenge isn't rage, it's reinvention. My rise wasn't about Eric or Olivia anymore. It was about becoming the woman I had once needed, strong, sure, and unshakably herself. But that didn't mean I couldn't send a message or two, quiet ones, stylish ones. Like when I got invited to speak at a women's leadership panel at work. I almost said no, imposter syndrome still nipping at my heels, but then I thought, what would the old me want to see? A woman who kept going, who stood up. So I said yes. I walked onto that stage in a crisp cream suit, hair pinned back, voice steady. I told my story, sanitized for the audience, but the truth shone through about self-worth, about learning the difference between love and control, about how power comes from choosing yourself every day. I saw Olivia in the back row. Yes, she was there. Our company had invited attendees from partner firms, and she was there, mouth slightly open, trying to hide behind a notebook. I didn't flinch. I didn't stumble. Instead, I smiled right at her as I said, sometimes the greatest love story you'll ever live is the one where you fall back in love with you. The applause that followed was deafening, but even more satisfying was the flicker in her eyes, the moment she realized she hadn't broken me, she'd awakened me. After the talk, a young intern came up to me, eyes bright. I want to be like you, she said. And I almost cried right there. This was it. This was the win. Eric texted again that night from a new number, just 4 words. You've really moved on. I didn't reply. What could I say that I hadn't already lived? Instead, I screenshot the text, sent it to my best friend with a laughing emoji, then deleted it. No rage, no burn, just freedom. And that's how I knew I'd won. Not because I had crushed them, but because they no longer mattered. Not to my joy, not to my success, not to my story. They were just characters in a chapter I had already closed. And me, I was already on the sequel. Months passed. Eric and Olivia faded into background noise. I heard through mutuals that they eventually started dating, though no one could confirm if it was love or just stubborn pride. They stopped showing up at events, they avoided the places we used to go, and when I crossed paths with anyone who still knew them, the whispers were always the same. You're doing so well. They look miserable. But I didn't care. Not anymore. Because true victory isn't about what they lost. It's about what I gained. I had boundaries now, standards, a life I loved, friends who saw me, work that challenged me, Days that began with peace and ended in gratitude. There was no space for bitterness, only beauty. I didn't get revenge in the way people imagine, with screaming matches or dramatic takedowns. No, I got it by glowing, by healing louder than they hurt me, by choosing joy when they expected me to drown. And the greatest irony? They had front row seats to all of it. That's what happens when you hurt someone who has nothing left to lose. She builds a life so radiant, your shadow can't even touch it. And that life, it's just beginning. I didn't think I'd ever hear about Eric or Olivia again. After that final text and the leadership panel, I deleted them from my mind the way I had from my contacts, swiftly and permanently. But the universe has a strange sense of humor. It tends to circle back just when you've forgotten to care. It began with whispers. A coworker mentioned that Olivia had been passed up for a promotion not just once, but twice. Apparently, management had concerns about her people skills. I almost laughed. People skills? The same woman who tried to sabotage another person's relationship out of sheer jealousy, who spent more energy manipulating others than managing herself? Meanwhile, Eric had apparently transferred departments. Word was he'd fallen behind on a major project and had publicly blamed his team during a review. The team, in turn, sent a private letter to HR detailing how he often checked out, took credit for others' work, and spent more time pacing the hallways on the phone than contributing. The golden boy was tarnishing fast. One day, I bumped into a former colleague from their company. Over coffee, she shared more. They're still together, she said, rolling her eyes. Well, kind of. They don't post about each other anymore, and from what I hear, it's toxic as ever. Eric's pulled away, and Olivia's spiraling? I didn't say much, just nodded. Because honestly, I didn't feel sorry for them. They weren't victims of circumstance, they were architects of their own downfall. Every brick, every crack, they laid it themselves. But that wasn't the most surprising part. A few weeks later, I got a LinkedIn notification. Eric had viewed my profile. I blinked at the screen, then laughed out loud. It was too perfect. The man who once ghosted me for being a red flag was now lurking on my professional milestones, watching me climb, watching me glow. What had he expected to find? Regret? Rebound photos? A bitter blog post? Instead, he saw promotions, speaking engagements, testimonials, growth, a life he didn't recognize because he'd never taken the time to see it in the first place. I never responded. I didn't need to. Silence, in this case, was the clearest message of all. But it didn't stop there. 2 months later, Olivia sent me a message on a throwaway Instagram account. No profile photo, no bio, just a DM that read, "I hope you're happy now, you ruined everything." I stared at the message for a moment, let it sit. Then I deleted it. Not because I was afraid to engage, but because I had no intention of stepping back into the arena with someone who still believed this was a game. I hadn't ruined anything. Their downfall wasn't my doing. It was the product of every insecure, manipulative decision they made together. I simply stepped out of the way and let gravity do its job. And gravity had done it well. Friends told me they rarely attended social events now, that Olivia's once glittering social media presence had gone quiet, that Eric's name no longer carried weight at the office. They'd become ghosts of their former selves, still together maybe, but held together by resentment, not love. One friend even said they fought openly in public now, at bars, in grocery stores. Eric walks ahead, Olivia shouting after him, people staring, whispering. I used to imagine scenarios like that, fantasize about their downfall. But now that it was real, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt detached because I'd learned something vital. Revenge is loud, closure is quiet. They were still stuck in the wreckage of a story I'd already rewritten, still trying to prove a point while I was busy building a legacy. I never needed them to crumble. I just needed to rise. Somewhere along the line, I realized their downfall wasn't a climax in my story. It was background noise. I didn't need their apology anymore. I didn't crave an explanation because their behavior had already told me everything I needed to know. Still, there was one moment that felt like the final poetic full circle. It was a charity gala I had been invited to attend. Black tie, high profile. I almost didn't go. Big events weren't really my scene anymore, but I did for myself. I walked in wearing a deep emerald dress that hugged my body like armor, hair swept up, and a silver clutch in hand. Halfway through the night, I saw them. Eric in a rumpled tuxedo, Olivia in a too tight gown, looked like she hadn't slept in days. They noticed me too. He did a double take, she froze. And just for a moment, we locked eyes. But there was no tension, no heat, only pity. Not for them. For the people they could have been had they chosen growth over games. They didn't approach me, they couldn't. Because standing in front of them was the woman they never thought I'd become. Composed, confident, untouchable. I didn't need to say a word, my presence said everything. Later that evening, someone whispered that they'd left early, barely spoke to anyone, kept to themselves in a shadowy corner. I didn't even bother to look for them. It's because I was too busy dancing, laughing, living. And when the night ended, I stepped into the cool air, head high, heart whole. There was no dramatic monologue, no parting shot, no revenge, only truth. They were no longer my villains. They were just irrelevant. I used to think love was about how much you could give, how much you could bend, how patient you could be, how willing you were to wait for someone to become the partner you needed them to be. But I was wrong. Love isn't sacrifice. It's not silence. It's not shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's version of acceptable. Real love, healthy, lasting love starts with how you treat yourself. And that was the greatest lesson I learned from Eric and Olivia. They were the harshest teachers I ever asked for, but in some strange way, I'm grateful because without them, I wouldn't have become the version of myself I am now. A version who listens to her gut, who protects her peace, who no longer mistakes control for concern or possession for passion. For the longest time, I thought I was broken, that I was the red flag they claimed. But the truth, I was a mirror. I reflected back on their insecurities, their manipulations, their fears, and they couldn't handle it. They tried to shatter me. But here's the thing about mirrors, even when cracked, they still reflect the truth. And mine, it's clearer than ever. Learn to pay attention to energy, to words that don't match actions, to friends who feel more like gatekeepers than allies, to the difference between someone who lifts you and someone who just wants you to need them. I've rebuilt my boundaries, not walls, but strong fences with open gates for those who respect them. My self-worth no longer lives in the hands of others. It lives in my choices, in my joy, on the way. I refuse to settle for anything less than mutual respect and intentional love. Sometimes people ask me if I miss him, if I ever wish things had gone differently. And honestly, because what came after peace, purpose, clarity is more valuable than any fairy tale I once tried to script in my head. That girl who waited for texts, cried over silences, begged to be seen, she deserved so much more. I became the woman who could give it to her. I still believe in love, but now I know what it should feel like: safe, open, free, not tethered to conditions or someone else's opinion. And if my story helps even one person walk away from something that hurts, helps them realize they're not too emotional, not too much, not too sensitive, then every tear, every heartbreak, every betrayal was worth it. Because we all deserve a love that doesn't make us question our sanity. We all deserve to choose ourselves. So that's what I'll keep doing every damn day. Recently, I started journaling again, not out of pain like before, but out of presence, to document the beauty in ordinary things. The way my coffee smells in the morning, the way the sunlight filters through my window at 7 o'clock a.m., the way my laughter now comes easily without explanation. This, to me, is a success. Not the paycheck, not the job title, not the curated photos, but peace. Peace of mind, peace of heart, peace of soul. And with that peace came people who matched it. Friends who don't compete or compare, a partner who listens without trying to fix, strangers who become soul connections simply because I now show up as myself without armor. And when I look back, I realize it wasn't about proving anything to Eric or Olivia. It wasn't about revenge or redemption. It was about reclaiming my story, taking the pen back, choosing how this chapter would end and how the next one would begin. So if you're reading this, if you've ever felt like you were the problem, like someone convinced you that your feelings were too loud or your love was too much, please hear this. You are not too much. You are just too real for someone who preferred illusions. The people who are meant to stay won't flinch at your fire. They'll warm their hands with it. And when you finally stop dimming your light to make others comfortable, you attract those who shine just as brightly. So no, I don't regret any of it. And the heartbreak, not the betrayal, not even the breakdown, because every piece of that pain pushed me home to myself. And that's the greatest love story I've ever lived. Sometimes the stories that break you are the ones that build you. They teach you boundaries, they teach you strength, they force you to face yourself in the mirror and ask, what do I really want? And when you answer honestly, everything changes. You stop settling, you stop explaining, you stop negotiating your worth. You start showing up. Not as the version of yourself someone else approves of, but as the full, unfiltered, fiercely alive soul you were born to be. That's what I've become. Not perfect, not invincible, but free. Free to feel, free to love, free to walk away. Eric and Olivia, they were just the storm that cleared the path. And me, I was the seed that cracked open, not to break, but to bloom. If you ever find yourself doubting your value because someone couldn't see it, let this be your reminder. You were never hard to love. You were just loving the wrong ones. Now love yourself louder, because you deserve nothing less.